Think about what it means when medicine, the art meant to heal, becomes a weapon of cruelty. Imagine doctors, trained to save lives, turning human bodies into test subjects, subjecting them to torture, starvation, freezing, disease. Then imagine that not just one or two, but hundreds of thousands were affected. The horror of war becomes something deeper, a systematic betrayal of humanity under white coats. What you're about to hear is not myth, it is real history. The story of how the regime of Nazi Germany, under the guise of science, turned infamous Auschwitz concentration camp, Dachau concentration camp, and other camps into laboratories of terror. This is medical horrors through history, and it demands to be known, not just as horror, but as a lesson. Between roughly 1939 and 1945, Nazi doctors conducted medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, prisoners of war, even children, often without consent under brutal conditions. The experiments had three main ostensible goals. Media group, black and white images of Nazi doctors preparing for experiments, historical documents outlining Nazi experiment goals, diagrams found in Nazi medical records, stock, distribute equally. To aid the German military, for example, testing survival under extreme cold, dehydration, high-altitude pressure. To test treatments for diseases and battlefield wounds like infections, malaria, typhus, bone grafts, sulfur drugs. And to validate racist, pseudoscientific theories of racial hygiene, a grotesque attempt to justify genocide. The result was steady suffering, death, mutilation. The recognized number of documented victims is at least 15,000, but many historians believe the real number is far higher. Roughly a quarter of those documented died as a direct consequence. In the camps, the experiments took many horrific forms. Some of the most notorious freezing or hypothermia experiments, mostly at Dachau, where prisoners were immersed in ice-cold water or left naked in freezing air to test how long a human could survive and the best methods for rewarming. Many died. Other experiments involved forced sterilization and reproductive mutilation. At Auschwitz, physicians such as Karl Klauberg injected caustic chemicals into women's uteruses in an attempt to close fallopian tubes, often causing agonizing pain, infections, internal bleeding, sometimes death. Infectious disease experiments were common too. Prisoners were deliberately infected with malaria, typhus, tuberculosis or other diseases, then subjected to untested treatments. In many cases, the treatments were brutal or non-existent. Other forms included surgical mutilation, experimental bone grafting or wound infliction to test sulfur drugs, exposure to toxic gases, intravenous poisons, forced blood transfusions, all without anesthesia or consent, purely for the supposed benefit of the Reich's science and war effort. Among the most infamous perpetrators was Josef Mengele, the angel of death of Auschwitz, who conducted twin experiments, grotesque pseudoscientific tests on identical twins, including children, measuring, infecting, mutilating, and often killing them for his so-called racial research. What makes these acts even more horrifying is that most of the experimentation had no real scientific justification. They were built on ideology, racist, dehumanizing ideology that labeled some people unworthy, subhuman, or genetically inferior. The Nazis regarded victims as disposable, specimens, rabbits, not human beings. That ideological foundation let doctors ignore medical ethics entirely. They stripped people of dignity. They discarded consent. They replaced compassion with cruelty. And they did it all under the guise of progress. When the war ended, the horrors came into public view. In the trials after the Second World War, notably the doctors' trial from 1946 to 47 at Nuremberg, 20 Nazi physicians and officials were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity for their role in the human experiments and the euthanasia programs. Several were sentenced to death, and many to prison. But not all perpetrators faced justice. Some escaped or died before trial. The trials laid the groundwork for modern human subjects' protections. They forced the medical world to confront the meaning of consent, dignity, ethics, leading eventually to ethical codes like the Nuremberg Code, which sets standards for medical research on human beings, meant to prevent such atrocities from ever recurring. For historians and ethicists, the Nazi medical crimes remain a stark reminder of how science divorced from morality becomes atrocity. First, never underestimate the danger when power, prejudice, and science combine. Always demand transparency, consent, human dignity. Any claim of research must be scrutinized, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations, refugees, prisoners, marginalized communities. Second, document and remember. As a history buff or documentary maker, exposing these stories matters. We must record evidence, preserve testimonies, keep memory alive. The victims had no voice then. Giving them a voice now is a duty. Third, apply awareness in modern contexts. In conflict zones, refugee camps, emergencies, ethics of care, consent, humanitarian principles must not be casual. Medical aid must go hand in hand with dignity and respect, not just efficiency or expediency. Finally, use history to guard the future. Recognizing how ideology and cruelty warped medicine in the past equips you to detect early warning signs when power abuses return. You become not just a spectator, but a sentinel of human dignity. The experiments conducted under Nazi death camps are among the darkest chapters in human history, not just because of their cruelty, but because they perverted the very mission of medicine. They remind us that human life must never be reduced to a data point, a specimen, a means to an end. They teach us the value of ethics, empathy, memory. They warn us, science without morality is danger wrapped in a lab coat. If this guide moved you, disturbed you, or forced you to confront a harsh truth, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most critical, controversial, and consequential moments. Share this video with fellow historians, ethicists, researchers, and anyone who must learn, remember, and never repeat.